Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and I am joined today by the Gritty Broman, my brother Brent, behind the camera. How you doing, Brent?
I'm well, thank you.
Today's podcast is about this guy named Frank Forrester, but that's not his real name, Brent.
What is that then?
That is his pen name. Do you know what a pen name is?
Yes. A pen name is what you put down when you don't want people to know that you're the one writing things. You know what's funny?
Like,
Mom told me one time that she reads some romance novels here and there, and she can always tell when there's a man writing under a woman's pen name. She's
I
like,
don't even want to know.
She's like, it's pretty obvious that was written by a man.
That's hilarious. So, yes, it's a fake name, you know. The real name of this man is Henry William Herbert.
It bothers me that his name isn't William Henry Herbert.
No, it's William Henry Herbert.
It is? I thought you said it was Henry William
That's
Herbert.
what I mean, Henry William. Because you're thinking Fort William Henry.
Yes, I want it to be William Henry Herbert.
No, it's Henry William.
I know, and it bothers me. It should be William Henry. It just rolls off the tongue better.
So we're going to read about this person because they are an influential person in American history who sort of is one of the leading voices in bringing the American sportsman to life in the United States. Okay, he's born in 1807 and he was raised in the English countryside near Spofforth, Yorkshire.
It's pronounced Spofforth.
Spofforth. How do you know?
I'm assuming. I can't even read the word.
So he comes from this really wealthy family, very wealthy. And his dad's like a reverend and a botanist, scientist person. In fact, he gets name dropped. His father gets name dropped in The Origin of Species, in Charles Darwin's book, the very famous book, The Origin of Species, because of his discoveries in plant genetics. So this is the father and the family that Henry William Herbert comes from. And just think Downton Abbey.
The upstairs people.
The wealthy people, the people of society, the people that, were gentry. And then you had your poor peasants in the street and stuff. They were not those people. They were the rich people. So he's born in a very privileged class. Okay. And his father passed on to his son his faith in ecologist Gilbert White's creed, later echoed by Henry David Thoreau, that, quote, the love of nature can make a very small place into a very large world. Right, Brent? Like a sandbox, like a little patch of dirt in your backyard can be a huge world to you if you're fascinated by nature. Like, look at the ant crawl and go into the thing and fascinated by ant hills and how they move things around. And all of a sudden, this little place becomes a huge world because you're fascinated by nature.
Yes, Brian. Perspective is everything. I hate this quote. We've
talked about this like 10 times now.
We've had some mechanical failures with the camera today.
Brent does not like this quote.
I don't like this quote. It's a good quote. I don't dislike it, but I think as far as a creed or a motto I'm going to impart to my children, that's not the top of the list.
Well,
your sandbox is a really big place. Don't worry, Billy.
During times of coronavirus, Brent, and we're all stuck in isolated locations, this could be a good quote.
Can you imagine having to deal with the coronavirus and no internet?
Let's have your child show up to you, Brent, and say, I'm bored, blah, blah, blah. You can tell them this. The world is huge if you're in love with nature.
No, I'm going to pull my mom and go, oh, you're bored? Well, I've got some cleaning for you to do. You should never tell someone you're bored. Yeah. It's a dangerous move.
I remember telling her, I'm bored. Hi, pleased to meet you.
Oh, Dad,
my name is Helen. And then it was, if you're bored, I've got dishes to do, garbage to take out, yard work to do. Let me know. And then all of a sudden we weren't bored anymore.
Yeah, and when we say take out the garbage, we meant burn the garbage.
Yeah, it probably wasn't the best environmental strategy.
No.
So getting back to the book, before we do that though, do us a favor. Head over to Mountain Ops. Get yourself some of this. This is a blaze shot. I've just had one. I'm amped right now. Energy and focus. I've got some Renew lately for some happy poops. You can use the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops, and you'll get free shipping on everything you order. Do that. That helps us out. Also, use the code GRITTY at Heather's Choice. And right now, during the COVID-19 coronavirus, Chinese virus, Wuhan Kung Flu, bro. 2020, I mean, it's happening fast.
And it's an epidemic,
Things
Brian.
are happening fast. I can say no to 2020 so far.
So far?
So far, it's not my favorite year.
You're going to be bear hunting in like 4 days.
I am going bear hunting in 4 days, folks, and I am taking with me some Heather's Choice. Did you see that? Did you see that segue? Heather's Choice. Get 15% off using the code GRITTY. Salmon chowder, can't beat. Packaroons, can't beat.
I could play like a Russian roulette. Any single one of those packaroons is good.
It's all good stuff. And it's good for food storage if you guys want a little extra because we don't know if the apocalypse is coming, you know? Go ahead and get yourself some freeze-dried dehydrated meals. So check that out and use the code GRITTY at Seek Outside for some backcountry shelters and stoves, titanium stoves, my favorite.
Which tent you guys taking on this trip?
We were talking about it this morning. Lampers and I aren't sure. He has a net for the Aeolus, though, and it weighs nothing. I don't think he has a net. And the only reason I say a net is because last year, it was hotter last year, though, way hotter, later time of year. The ticks, man. It's hard to sleep without the ticks, like, crawling on you. It's just nice to, to shake off, make sure you don't have anything on your person, and then
crawl into your bag.
So I don't know. Haven't figured out what I'm going to do yet. So there's that. You can use the code GRITTY at Graxaw Game Bags. Get yourself some game bags, which I got new game bags.
Yep. The new extra large.
Extra large. So check that out. 6 ounces for these tiny, tiny game bags. Compact, lightweight, durable, boneless. These are boneless. These are for packing out boned out meat bags.
They're reusable. Just wash them in your washer and dryer. And they're the proper color.
Yeah, they are bright orange.
It bothers me that game bags that you wrap around the animal's head are white.
Some of them have reflectors on them or reflective string, so that helps. But
yeah,
use the code GRITTY at Sissy Sticks, and we have another code that's also available for a short time.
Another month or two.
And that is with alpaca rafts. You can save 10% on a pack of rafts right now if you use the code GRITTY2020. So use that code, and you can save. And it's a great product. Ryan and I are both bringing our own rafts on this bear hunt. We're going to be traversing some waterways, and these boats are you're talking 7 pounds for a complete boat that can carry 400 or 500 pounds across a river, down a river. So it's amazing.
And you get 10% off the whole store.
Yeah. So if you need a dry suit, some paddles, whatever, check it out.
Jackets.
Yep. Use the code GRITTY there, GRITTY2020 at Alpaca Rafts. All right, getting back into the story, Brent. So there's this rich kid, Henry William Herbert, has the pen name Frank Forrester later on, and he ends up being one of the primary influencers for changing and developing basically the American sportsman persona. Okay, Brent, so just to paint a picture of his childhood. At age 13, after a genteel childhood among the rural gentry and its horses, hounds, and private tutors, Henry William was sent to Eton, from which, after 5 years, he advanced to Cambridge.
So, super smart kid.
Silver
lots
spoon.
Of tutors. Silver spoon. Now he's at an elite.
Yep.
Do they have Ivy League colleges
basically,
in Europe?
Cambridge. Visiting his classmates' homes, he lived to the hilt, the active, lavish life of a young aristocrat, and came to know intimately England's greatest estates and its sporting country life. So he was spoiled. He got to go onto big estates and hunt because that was a pastime that was available to the rich, and he was rich. So while at Cambridge, he was not a reading man, what was known as a reading man. It says that he passed most of his time in pursuit of field sports and athletic, pedestrian, and equestrian exercises. So he was on horseback or he was on foot, and he was doing athlete stuff, track and field kind of things, and outdoorsy fella. But as you can imagine, he was kind of that 90210 kid that grew up spoiled, and as a student, did a lot of bad things in terms of partying.
Oh.
Upon graduation in January 1829, the young gentleman was a fine specimen of his race, a historian accounts. He was tall and erect, free from this blah, blah, blah. Okay? But in the spring 1830, his early indiscretions and college debts resulting from his weakness for roistering and gambling caught up with him. At the same time, a promised share of a family trust was absconded with by a notorious speculator and swindler. Thus, suddenly reduced from affluence and threatened with bankruptcy, he fled to the continent. The continent, Brent, is the United States. I think it's funny how in England they called it the continent, capital C. Informed that a writ of outlawry existed against him, he decided to put even greater distance between himself and his creditors, as well as the shame he'd brought upon his renowned family. And he booked passage from America. His vessel slipped into New York Harbor in the spring of 1831. Okay, so in 1831, so he's born 1807, grows up, pretty wealthy, has a lot of things, loves the outdoors, very athletic guy, super smart, graduating top of his class in a lot of areas. Graduates from college, though, and he's got some dirty little secrets and some debt. There were other things that people think might have been the problem. Just to paint a picture, in this Downton Abbey era, you have this thing where that outlawry, such as a student running up horrendous debts, was not uncommon among well-born youth of the period, and Henry's father likely could have paid the debt. That wasn't the issue. The real source of shame and the need for flight may have been a more contemptible social transgression. So they think maybe that he was involved in homosexuality, which was still punishable by death in England, or incest, which was a rumor that circulated, or a more charitable account says that his exile was because of his unusual behavior, that he was an odd dude, hard to get along with, blah, blah, blah. For whatever reason, he gets on a boat and he goes to America, and he arrives in America in the New York Harbor in the spring of 1831. And then for the next 10 years, he kind of establishes himself. He's a writer. He's a teacher. He teaches young people, which he kind of doesn't want people in England to know because, it's kind of looked down on for him to be working as a teacher. Heaven forbid. And it's so funny. There was a lot of social things back then. So he starts hanging out with horse riders and horse racers, because at the time it was kind of this new sporting thing. Horse people. And they hunt on horseback, and they have these little clubs in the South and the East that they get together and they ride horses. Anyway, it ends up, he gets into writing books, and his books aren't well liked. Critics don't like him. They kind of suck. But he's a good writer. They're not that good. Technically, he's a good writer, but his stuff is boring. Okay. He's well educated. Then he stumbles across this group of people that own a paper, and they say, hey, dude, you really should write some sporting stories, because you're flirting with it with these horse racing stories, and we can see you're writing, but you should write some hunting and adventure stories. And he's like, that's sort of beat writer, low brow kind of stuff. I'm too special.
Redneck.
And yeah, it's a little too redneck for me. And they're like, well, you should do it under the name Frank Forrester as a pen name. And he's like, oh, if I can write it anonymously as a fake person, yeah.
I'm in.
So he does this. And he ends up writing books that end up changing American history. Okay. It says in the book, delivery for a Herbert came from the young growing American sporting press, the origins of which lay with attorney Baltimore postmaster John Stuart Skinner, founder in 1819 of the American Farmer magazine. So there's these publications that are kind of newish, where they're starting to write hunting and sporting stories. And keep in mind, this is really new. Like, most people hunted to eat. You're talking Daniel Boone and others, trapping.
America is still not.
Yeah, the frontier is still not settled.
There, yeah. And you're still in the middle of the Wild West.
And so the idea of having this sort of pretentious Englishman riding a horse, hunting foxes on horseback with hounds, that's a different kind of world, right? And so it says in the book, the term sport itself was still largely associated with Bowery's bachelor subculture known as the fancy. Young working class men who caroused, raised hell, and gambled on cockfighting, ratting, and billiards, leading many early contributors of hunting and sport-related regional tales generally to ask that they be published under a pseudonym. So basically, it was kind of trashy writing. Anything around sport was considered garbage, like lowbrow activity. And later we'll get into what what exactly that means. But Henry William Herbert, in his mind, had a vision of what sporting was. And it was completely different than what the mainstream kind of said what sporting was. And it says, in his mind, hunters would pit themselves against elusive, dangerous animals in forbidding terrain, possessing unique narrative power. Fine literature, these stories were not, but they were immensely readable evocations of both nature and humanity. As man engaged in a supreme and suspenseful test of character and endurance, aware that their New York acquaintance Henry William Herbert was an outdoorsman. As for sport, Henry William much resented the way it had been tainted as grubby and demoralizing by the aimless hustlers of the fancy and a physical cultist. He frowned upon the way American men had grown listless and dull from the failure to lead vigorous lives. That sounds a lot like Theodore Roosevelt.
Strenuous life.
Yeah. He didn't like how the word had been taken, sport had been taken, that it was about gambling and hustlers, and that this lifestyle of living in civilization had made men grow listless and dull from the failure to lead a vigorous life. He need look no further than his own undergraduate indulgences. Remember, he was gambling, drinking, and he had loss of control. And in his opinion, the outdoors had restorative virtues to a man's character and well-being. He says, when first it was my fortune to become a dweller on the Atlantic seaboard of the United States, the word sportsman was understood to mean not him who rises with the dawn to inhale the pure breeze of the uplands or the salt gale of the great salt bay in innocent and invigorating pursuit of the wild game of the forest or the ocean wave, but him who by the light of a flaring gas lamp, breathing gas fumes, watches, flushed and feverish, through the livelong night until the morning star to pluck his human pigeon over the green field of the faro table. Don't quite understand exactly what it means, but I think what he's saying is that the word sportsman meant someone up at, gas lamp, gambling, betting, or snatching a pigeon off a roost for eating it, whatever. Like, it wasn't this thing that he says is a man who rises at dawn to inhale the pure breeze of the ocean and the uplands and indulge in the invigorating pursuit of wild game of the forest or the ocean wave. Instead, it was this gambling person drinking too much, spending all their money, staying up all night. Totally different images of what sport and sportsman is, right? So this is what he's up against, and he is creating writing that is saying, no, that's not what a sportsman is. A sportsman is this. It's this guy over here.
Noble.
Mm-hmm. He felt that the hunting ethos and getting guys outdoors and hunting in a noble way would restore their soul and would get them out of the cancerous saloons and poker dens. So he writes these books, Brent. And from 1839 to 1858, for space of nearly 20 years, his writing becomes wildly popular under the pen name Frank Forrester, right? His other writings, not so much. Nobody cared. But Frank Forrester becomes big time. And he's able to write in a way that people really feel like they're there on the hunt. And the same things he wrote about in the past that nobody really liked, those skills applied well to nature writing and to describing a hunt. And there's an excerpt in the book here where he talks about, getting some birds with 3 guys, flushing a group of quail and hitting their limit and this adventure, right? And he's not too bad. He's a good writer. And so this gets him notoriety under this pen name. He becomes famous under that pen name. He starts changing the national scene and starts getting people thinking of sportsmen and hunting and outdoors in a different way, and they start advocating at this time for game laws. Never had them before. Didn't really have this. And so it says in the book, in Frank Forrester, Herbert had hit upon a literary persona that was the best possible version of himself. And he had basically kind of taken all the good things about himself being a sportsman and shed all the garbage of his other personality bits and stuff that were kind of part of him. And it says the readers wrote, they loved him, right? And he became popular right out the gate. Whoever Frank Forrester may be, present to him, my dear sir, the hearty thanks of one who almost envies him with power to enjoy a week in the woodlands, which is the name of his book, and still more the happy talent to impart its pleasures to others. So people love the books, and they do really well. But he has a harsh personality. People don't get along with him. He tends to piss people off, and his ego is always in the way. He's the kind of guy that wants to duel everybody. You know, he just can't keep his mouth shut. And so even though he's a good writer and he does really good under the name Frank Forrester, the rest of his life is kind of always a mess. Nevertheless, he ends up putting out tons of books under Frank Forrester. He wrote the Warwick Woodland series. He wrote The Shooting Box, The Deer Stalkers, The Quarrendon Hounds, the Warwick Popular. He produced a bunch of hunting guides too. American Game in its Seasons in 1853, A Complete Manual for Young Sportsmen in 1856, and Frank Forrester's Horse and Horsemanship of the U.S. and British Provinces in 1857. Another Frank Forrester's Fish and Fishing went through several editions between 1850 and 1866. So he's a big-time sports writer, like hunting adventure writer. And this is the part, though, as he creates his persona and he starts to change the way hunters, and he starts building the culture around hunting. It says he was also an early advocate of recognized hunting seasons and an opponent of practices that violated the ethos of gentlemanly sport, such as shooting birds anywhere but in flight. So, you can't shoot a turkey in the roost. You can't shoot a duck that's landed on the pond. You need to go shoot these birds in flight. You can't shoot a quail on the ground. You shoot them when they fly. That's kind of definitely this whole sporting chance thing. It's interesting because, man, it sure is easy to shoot a duck just sitting on the water. Let it land, then shoot. You shoot more. So he didn't like it when people use artificial lights to freeze deer in place, or the use of dogs to force deer into water so you could shoot them in water. There's certain things that he was like, okay, this is not good for animals. The way that you're hunting them isn't fair, and so on. And so he's putting laws in place. And in 1844, he cheered the formation of the 80-member New York Sportsman's Club, NYSC, one of the first in America. That's in 1844. And it was dedicated to preserving game, and the club sought to curtail the sale of wild game at market and to impose closed seasons on fowl, trout, and deer. In its advocacy, the NYSC used a model law written by Herbert, which was adopted by some counties but was kept from becoming state law due to intensive lobbying so restaurants and stuff were like, nope, sorry. So there were these battles against it becoming law. And Herbert warned of the imminent extinction of some birds within the outlying areas of New York unless its more affluent citizens could change their dining habits. He's like, look, we need to educate people because the restaurants aren't going to do it. Restaurants aren't going to change how people buy. People are going to change how people buy. And I think that's an important lesson, that you can sit here and go, we need this law, we need this law, we need this law. But what's more powerful than a law is educating people, right? When people go, okay, whenever I eat a woodcock and there's not that many of them, I'm endangering the wild population of woodcock. I'm going to stop eating woodcock. Instead, I'm going to eat chicken, whatever. By having those laws and by having that education in place, by teaching people through the club and so on, changing the dining habits of people and how they purchase, then you change people's how people kill and take wildlife. And so sometimes I think we often attack these issues from the standpoint of the law. Let's make it illegal for restaurants to do this. Or get people not to buy that product, and then the restaurants will quit killing them. So much of it is often education and consumer driven. If you can change the mind of the consumer, you can change the behavior more fully than you can. It's sort of like, when it comes to poaching, like a rhino horn. If the consumer wasn't there that wanted to purchase it, then
you wouldn't be killing the rhinos.
You wouldn't be killing the rhino.
So you mean if the Chinese people stopped eating weird things,
yes,
bad things would stop happening?
Well, you could look at it that way, Brent.
Well, I don't know who else wants a friggin' rhino horn.
Oh, okay. Therefore, despite law, common sense, and common humanity, the bird is butchered at all times. Isn't that interesting? Even where game laws existed, they were hard to enforce, as there were no game wardens at the time. Fortunately, colonial legal precedent allowed citizens to sue those who sold or possessed wild game out of season. As many of the NYSC members were lawyers, they had considerable success in this regard. So basically, they could just sue each other, sue someone who broke the law. So they didn't have game wardens in place, but your neighbor might sue you and make you obey the law. Anyway, the club would visit restaurants and see what were on the menu, what the specials were, and they'd find animals that were out of season. You couldn't hunt right now.
How'd you get this?
And then, and then they would basically sue them. And so this did help preserve the game by stopping the restaurants from feeding it to New Yorkers in fancy restaurants. And it put a crimp on rural poaching and illegal hunting. So the farmers get ticked off about this. This is very interesting. And they write this scathing thing, and they paint themselves as an aggrieved party, saying that, this group of hunters is really bad. So get this. This is really interesting. Farmers constituted an aggrieved class in the world of early game legislation, often complaining that such laws arranged seasonal schedules for hunters, both sport and market shooters, to go traipsing over the countryside, but did not adequately safeguard private property rights. And so they were like, dude, they'll just go in and they'll just shoot a bunch of stuff. The farmers said in this New York paper to the Spirit of the Times, they said, on the first day that the law permits, they issue in droves from the dens and groggeries of our towns and villages, and not unlike the predatory vandals, they ride down fences, grain, and grass, killing game in useless and unnecessary quantities, and sometimes, in their intolerable insolence, kill sheep for rabbits and chickens for partridges. So the farmers are like, dude, these people are just crap. They come out here and they just shoot stuff. Sometimes they shoot our animals, our livestock. They break the law. They do all these things. So Herbert wrote a response, and he says, and he supported the farmer complaints, but he said he supported them about idling, groggery, haunting poachers, but insisted these may not be mistaken for the better followers of the chase. The true sportsman, he said, abhors the whole race of them, knowing that his gentle occupation is by them brought into disgrace and disrepute. He pointed out that game laws, by protecting birds and birds' breeding cycles, ultimately benefited the farmer by sustaining a population of birds which devoured insects. He urged the farmers to join the campaign for game laws in collaboration with the sporting men of the cities, as the real interest and object of the two parties were identical. Does that make sense? So it's funny. It's the same thing going on today. People go out and you'll see, some photo that says in a paper that says hunters kill 10 deer, and there'll be deer laying in a field with their heads chopped off. Mm-hmm. And hunters say, those aren't hunters. Those are poachers. Like, there's a difference. There's a big difference between a poacher and a hunter. By definition, someone who follows the law, obeys game laws, has a tag in his pocket and a license to hunt, and follows the rules, that is a hunter. And he follows the rules of the season, whether it be archery or rifle. That is a hunter. Someone who goes out and breaks all those laws is a poacher. Now, anti-hunting groups love to conflate the two.
Yeah.
They love to call everyone that kills an animal a hunter. And so that way they can kind of confuse us with poachers. And then when hunters go over there and legally harvest a lion, any animal really, that's legal, they go out there and they follow the law and they do it. And then someone goes out and poaches and murders a rhino. They want us to be put in the same bucket, poachers and hunters. And so at this time, this person, Herbert, he's out there fighting our battle, educating people, putting in game laws, keeping restaurants from exploiting birds and all the wild animals for sale, trying to make it so that there are game laws, bag limits, seasons, methods of take that are legal and illegal, and explaining the difference between what a sportsman is and what a poacher is.
I bet he had a really hard time with that.
But it's powerful, right? So the story kind of takes a turn, though, Brent. It's a little dark, kind of gets sad. Mm-hmm. His wife dies in 1846, I think, somewhere 1844. She died in his arms, and he's broken. He's a broken man, depressed and sad, bereft of his wife. His daughter dies. His son, he ends up sending to England to live with his father, and so he has no son either, and he's alone. So he ends up with this home on some acreage in the middle of nowhere in this beautiful area in New Jersey off the banks of the Passaic River, and he calls the place the Cedars. And he basically starts becoming depressed. He continues to write for another 10 years or so. During that time, he's out hunting and doing stuff in the outdoors and so forth, but he never quite gets over that loss of his wife and his loneliness. And later, in 1858, he marries this gal named Adela, and it seems like he falls in love again. It's kind of a surprise. It happened quick, and he falls in love, but after 6 weeks, she leaves him.
Oh, geez.
That proves to be very devastating. It says in the book that the jilted author briefly rallied, taking a room in a posh hotel on Lower Broadway in New York, from which to stage a campaign to win the girl back. But a formal, discouraging rejection soon arrived from Adela's attorney. There was no hope of reconciliation.
Jeez.
Herbert, humiliated and deeply hurt, confided his desperation to a loyal former student who, on May 17th, at Herbert's urgent request, had arrived to keep him company. That night, having prepared detailed suicide notes, he entered the suite's bedroom, gazed at himself one last time in a bureau mirror, and raised a gun to his head. The papers the next day were filled with the sensation and scandal of the case. A famous man's love-suicide. But there was also genuine remorse for the interesting Englishman who had created not only Frank Forrester, a persona for spreading the gospel of sport hunting, but also another relatively new figure, the American sportsman. Over the coming years, as the sordid details of his life and death receded in memory, it was the ardent purity of his mission that resounded. He became, to a degree he could not have imagined, and of which he might have disapproved, beloved for his accomplishment. Quote, our Frank, unquote. For a generation from 1839 to 1858, he had tamed the outdoors and thrust America into it, while making the sporting chase an acceptable, even refined recreation that Theodore Roosevelt would one day call the best of all national pastimes. I think this is right here where he says, the interesting Englishman who had created not only Frank Forrester, a persona for spreading the gospel of sport hunting, but also another relatively new figure, the American sportsman. So that's basically a 20-year window where he wrote and influenced change in early America. This is just before the Civil War, where you basically bring his Cambridge upbringing and his gentlemanly ways and the way he viewed nature, and that he saw nature as a healing place. Just like Theodore Roosevelt. Remember, Theodore Roosevelt, the healing outdoors, the strenuous life, the vigors of the outdoors, they're that antidote to depression and melancholy. And it appears that this man, Henry William Herbert, that he also found solace in the outdoors, and that was what he used to combat his melancholy, his sadness. It also kept him from indulging in gambling and women and, and all the dark kind of underbelly of society that he could fall prey to. And I think it's true today. Getting outdoors, living outdoors, the vigorous life of struggle from the hunt, the chase. Those things are built into our DNA, and they
being
have a
inside
way
four walls 24/7 is weird.
It's not how the human is meant to be. So yeah, he and then through his writings, he's able to create a persona and now change the meaning of sportsman, and what it is to be a sportsman, not a poacher, not a killer, but someone who cares about wildlife, and then enacted and fought for helped create one of the first clubs in the United States for protecting of wildlife. It had like 88 members, most of them attorneys, it said. So they were able to sue anyone who broke the game law. Just really interesting. And so Theodore Roosevelt comes on the scene much later. So Herbert dies in just before the Civil War. And then, years later, Theodore Roosevelt in 1901 becomes president of the United States. So Theodore Roosevelt has,
some groundwork laid for him.
The groundwork laid for him, yeah. He has this kind of thing that, boom, just kind of came out and came to be that didn't exist before. You have Charles Darwin's books, Origin of Man, and it kind of changing science, blending with, culture and religion. You have a culture war going on. Regarding hunting, what hunting should be and what it is versus what it should be. Anyway, really interesting bit of history there. And the reason I bring it up on the show at all is because it helps build context for what comes next. as we kind of understand our past so that we can understand our future. Some takeaways from this. It's always better to educate than it is to legislate.
Yep.
It just is. The more you can educate people, the more you can help people understand right and wrong, or what is, or even what's best for society and wildlife, which can be debated. But the more people understand, the more likely you're to affect change than when you just write a law. It's like the law, like there's a mass shooting, ban guns, make them all illegal. It doesn't. Education is what's going to change, and it's not going to. It's the law. Laws aren't. They're only as good as the society that's willing to obey the laws behind the law.
Americans have a proud tradition of not liking being told what to do.
Yeah, I'm one of those Americans.
Can you imagine trying to impose game laws back then? Bill, you can't go over there and shoot deer anymore that you've been shooting for the last 40 years. You now got to come pay the tax man his fair share.
Yeah.
Some people, I'm sure, had a real hard time.
But if they understood that by obeying game laws, there's more game, then you have a person who genuinely cares for wildlife going, oh, I'm going to do what I can to ensure that wildlife exists now and long after I'm gone for the generations that are still in the womb of time, So anyway, that's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning into the podcast. And don't forget to check out our coupon codes. You can find them all in the description field of this video. If you need some stuff from any of those companies we're working with, support them because they support us. We appreciate you listening, and stay gritty.